Hey everyone! So, last time on grading the Avengers, things went a little rough. But this time, I think things are going to go a lot better, both for the comics I'm going to review and my overall opinion and relationship with that and the audience. So with that in mind, let's begin round 12 of grading the Avengers. If you haven't been checking out this series, be sure to subscribe to Comic Island by clicking on that button down below the video. And for those of you who have been enjoying this series, consider joining our new membership program, which also has a button down below this video. So Harris's run was long and often collaborative. Near the end of his time with the Avengers, he was joined by longtime Marvel editor Terry Kavanagh as a co-writer for a dozen or so issues until Terry took over as the sole writer for the series. And this time period for the Avengers is so different and distinct from the one that came before that I largely credit to Bob Harras, that I absolutely felt the need to create a separate review for the books with Kavanagh's name attached to them. For those that are fans of the 90s era Avengers and have been defending it, I do wonder how often people are referring to this part of Bob Harras' time with the series, because while I failed to connect with most of it, around the time that Terry comes along, my thoughts on the series change completely. Much of that can be attributed to Kavanagh, who as editor for Marvel in the 90s seems well regarded for the creative freedom he offered for writers and artists. That attitude seems reflected in his writing for the Avengers, because everything just suddenly cuts loose. Kavanagh goes big and broad and fills his books with all sorts of neat ideas. Most significantly, though, is the art team that actually did start before Kavanagh joined the series, but seemed to be working in perfect concert with his writing style. It is the most 90s the Avengers get in terms of the stereotypes this decade is known for in the world of comics and its art style. Everything is profoundly over the top, the art takes on this huge focus, and the plot kind of falls to the wayside in comparison. Broadly speaking, I have often criticized 90s books along these lines, but that often has to do with them following the same patterns, slavishly copying the style of popular artists at the time like Rob Liefeld or Todd McFarlane. I find a lot of the books I dislike from the 90s tend to copy the style of those artists without really having any intent behind them, but that couldn't be further from the truth when it comes to Kavanagh's Avengers. These books, with guest artists like Angel Medina, Scott Koblish, John Kalish, Fabio Laguna, MC Wyman, along with the regulars, at this point Mike Deodato and Tom Palmer, who as I said had already started before Terry Kavanagh, this series is given this incredible injection of life I found astounding. I put it on the thumbnail, but I want to make this point very clear. This era of Avengers artwork is my absolute favorite. Mike Deodato, at this point, is my favorite Avengers artist. He and all the other lovely people I mentioned, along with a handful of others, just go for it with their artwork. The Avengers of this era has a particular style and is very much of its time because of it. But if you're going to go for a creative direction like this, it's best to pump that gas and go for it hard. If you're going to do something, especially something like this, there's no settling for halfway measures, and that's not what this book does. It goes all the way. And because of that, we get this colorful, vivid artwork that really stuck with me. Kavanagh and Deodato seem to understand the idea of really going for it better than any other creative team. Kavanagh and Deodato seem to really understand that better than any other creative team in the 1990s for the Avengers. And the end result is one of my favorite 90s comics I've had the privilege to read to date. I often pick on this decade, but it is in part because I know great books like these exist out there. And I also know a lot of the industry could have done better and done more experimental and fun stuff like these Avengers books. I absolutely credit Deodato, Kavanagh, and Tom Palmer in particular for that, because they are the only common element of these books. Harris, a couple other writers, and the other artists would come and go around this time, but it's those three that are the common element that made these books great. The art is so colorful, detailed, and interesting that almost everything else feels secondary and less important. To me, because comics are a fusion of writing and art, it is possible, in the right circumstances, for art to make up for a lackluster story. Kavanagh does it a little bit better than that, though. His style is complementary to Deodato's tendency to go big. It is not only serviceable to the artwork, but it does a really good job at keeping my attention. So even if, as sometimes happens in these books, there might be a weird moment, a goofy little bit of dialogue, or a really silly looking design for Captain America over a couple of pages, none of that really bothers me. Because what's most important is the dynamic and how these books feel overall. Bob Harris's initial run certainly flirted with more interesting art using a wider variety to it, especially compared to what had happened before in the Avengers series. And that's where even before Kavanagh, Deodato, and Palmer already started to stand out. But it's Kavanagh's tendency to write big with them, as I said, and the frequent use of guest artists that meant things really reached a whole new level here. And I think it was kind of needed. It's this kind of artwork that would have made me put a lot more enthusiasm into the first Bob Harris review, if you can count this one as a second. But I don't really want to credit Bob Harris too much for any of this. The series isn't really affected once he leaves, and Kavanagh goes solo for a while with the occasional help on scripts or breakdowns, and the books are still great. To me, Terry Kavanagh is such an essential part of why these books work, and Bob Harris so very clearly is not. I know I clearly have a bit of a grudge against that guy, but I'm strictly talking about the quality of the comics here, and how they changed almost immediately after Kavanagh joined the series, and didn't change after Bob Harris left. So yes, Captain America might look goofy here and there, and there might be a couple of rough dialogue patches elsewhere, but these are small, tiny things that really don't matter much against a series that was really trying out new things. I love the look of Red Skull when he shows up, or even just when we have a more generic adventure with the swordsman returning. It's stunning how a very simple or even boring story can be so incredibly transformed by artists giving their all. The 90s are kind of famous in the history of comics for really attempting to give artists their due, and credit for the incredible work they do in making these books come alive. To date, it's something that the industry struggles with, and arguably the 90s was actually best at. Because at the time, art was pretty sincerely the most important thing to a comic. So it makes sense it would take up a huge amount of the focus for the Avengers as it got deeper into the decade. And while I love these books themselves and don't think their sales were suffering all that much, there was trouble brewing behind the scenes. Through a series of cataclysmic decisions involving larger trends within the industry that changed it into a speculative market, leading to massive overextension, coupled with another series of bad business decisions by Marvel, specifically this whole dispute with Diamond as their distributor and deciding to buy a bunch of failing toy brands, Marvel Comics found themselves on the verge of bankruptcy, with major decisions needed to salvage things and the apparent end of Marvel publishing their own comics. Whatever plans that might have existed for the future of the Avengers came to an abrupt and sudden end. I don't think Kavanagh was ever planned to be a permanent figure within the series anyways, and it seems like since then he's left the industry entirely. But whatever the plan was, he left the series on the eve of the Avengers hitting their landmark 400th issue, and Mark Waid would be brought in to essentially wrap up the now cancelled Avengers series. It's kind of a big deal and does make me feel sad. We're reaching the end of an era after 400 books, and the Avengers would never run as long or uninterrupted again. But don't worry, we still are going to cover those final few issues and more in future rounds. But I had to bring this up now because it's worth marking Terry Kavanagh's time as the true end of an era for the Avengers, one that we can never really go back to. Counting annuals, after well over 400 books, this remarkable series was brought to an end because some people at Marvel at the time didn't do business very good. And it's disappointing to think about, to say the least. But I can also really appreciate that the last true run of books in Avengers history were pretty solid on the whole. Terry Kavanagh and Mike Deodato really put out some fun energy, which was firmly and quite wonderfully pushing the series in a new and cool direction. It didn't last, and ultimately the Avengers had a very different history than what was outlined here. But I do love this take on the team so much more than what would follow not long after. Let it never be said that I hate all 90s comics, because when they work for me, gosh do they work well. It should be made very clear that a B+ is a strong-ass grade, one that we haven't covered before. I realize it seems diminished a bit because we're not in full-blown A territory, but with a scale that by my own rules only exists against other Avengers books, and is spread out such that each letter grade gets roughly the same amount of creative runs attached to it, a B+ really does make this run one of my all-time favorites. Not only does it comfortably slot it in my personal top 10, it also stands out enough to be a real personal recommendation I thoroughly enjoyed. It doesn't quite hit the A, less so for its goofier moments and more so that it was short and sweet without a ton of depth to it. And compared to some other truly awesome runs in Avengers history, well, you kind of need that depth to get to the A. I do feel some other series managed to achieve their own creative goals with an ambition that this series simply didn't have. So in other words, yeah, I really like these books, but they're not nearly as influential as someone like Roy Thomas, or as meaningful as Roger Stern. They are about as fun as those eras, though, and that really does say something. When it comes to how it compares to other significant runs in Avengers history, Terry Kavanagh and Mike Deodato keep up with the best of the best. So with that, make sure you join me next time as we cover the end of the first volume of Avengers, as Mark Waid takes over the series for a brief flicker of a moment before it was all ended, and then we're going to move on to Heroes Reborn. And that's going to be a whole other thing. Thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you next time.